You probably haven't thought about Saturn in a while, but there was a time when this small division of General Motors was seen as a bold experiment, a sign of hope, and maybe even a glimpse of the future of American cars. Saturn was supposed to change everything. It was supposed to be a clean slate, a new way of building cars, a new way of selling them, and a new way of treating customers. The idea was simple: beat the Japanese imports at their own game. Honda and Toyota were building small, affordable, reliable cars that people actually wanted. By the early 1980s, GM was losing badly in that market. The Chevrolet Cavalier wasn't enough. Pontiac, Oldsmobile, and Buick weren't bringing in younger buyers. GM needed something fresh, something that didn't feel like the same old Detroit product with a different badge on the hood. So, in 1985, General Motors officially announced the birth of Saturn. They didn't just call it a new brand, they called it, and I quote, a different kind of car company. And for a while, that wasn't just marketing. It really was different. Saturn had its own factory, built from scratch in Spring Hill, Tennessee. It had its own engineers, its own advertising, its own way of dealing with workers and unions. Even its dealerships were set up differently. No haggling, no sneaky add-ons, no stressful bargaining. The price was the price, take it or leave it. It was honest, it was refreshing, and buyers loved it. The first Saturns hit the market for the 1991 model year, and immediately people noticed. These weren't flashy cars, they weren't luxury cars, but they were practical, affordable, and they felt like something new. Dent-resistant polymer body panels meant your doors wouldn't get dinged up in the grocery store parking lot. The styling was clean, the cars were simple, and for a moment, Saturn looked like it was on the right track. There's a story from the early 90s that shows just how strong the Saturn following was. In 1994, the company hosted the first Saturn Homecoming event at its Spring Hill headquarters. More than 44,000 Saturn owners drove in from all over the country. They turned it into a festival, complete with concerts, tours of the plant, and a celebration of what Saturn meant to them. Imagine that. Tens of thousands of people throwing a party just because they loved their car brand. You don't see that with Buick or Oldsmobile. Saturn had built something special. But there were cracks forming beneath the surface, and those cracks would eventually grow into the reasons Saturn failed. The first problem was money. Saturn's independence was great for creativity, but terrible for efficiency. Every part, every platform, every engine had to be developed separately from the rest of GM. That meant costs skyrocketed. By the late 1990s, Saturn was losing about $3,000 per vehicle. GM poured billions into the experiment, and the return just wasn't there. The second problem was the lineup. For most of the 1990s, Saturn only sold small cars, compact sedans, and coupes. Meanwhile, the market was shifting. People were buying SUVs, minivans, and mid-size cars. Saturn didn't have any of those until way too late. The Saturn Vue SUV didn't arrive until 2002, more than a decade after the brand launched. By then, Honda had the CR-V, Toyota had the RAV4, and Ford had the Explorer. Saturn was playing catch-up. And when Saturn did finally expand, the results were mixed at best. The L-Series mid-size sedan launched in 2000, but it was plagued with recalls and mechanical issues. The Ion Compact replaced the original S-Series in 2003, but it was criticized for cheap materials and odd design choices, like putting the instrument cluster in the middle of the dash. The Relay minivan came and went without much attention. The Aura sedan and Sky Roadster were stylish, but they arrived too late to save the brand. By the early 2000s, Saturn had lost its identity. The dent-resistant body panels were gone. The unique engineering gave way to badge-engineered models that were basically Opels from Europe or Chevys with different grills. The brand that was supposed to be different now looked just like everything else in GM's crowded lineup. And then came the scandals. The Ion was eventually caught up in GM's massive ignition switch recall, a defect that caused engines to shut off while driving. was linked to at least 13 deaths. Recalls like that destroyed what little reputation Saturn had left for quality. At the same time, GM itself was in crisis. The company was bleeding money in the mid-2000s. When the financial crisis hit in 2008, things got worse. GM had to go into bankruptcy protection, and as part of its restructuring, it decided to cut brands. Pontiac, Hummer, Saab, and yes, Saturn were all marked for death. But there was almost a twist ending. In 2009, Penske Automotive tried to buy Saturn. The deal looked promising. Penske wanted to keep Saturn alive by sourcing cars from other manufacturers, including Renault Samsung in South Korea. But at the last minute, Renault pulled out, and the deal collapsed. That was the end. By October 2010, Saturn was gone. Dealerships closed. The Spring Hill plant moved on to building other GM models, and Saturn faded into history. So why did Saturn fail? It wasn't one thing. It was a combination of high costs, limited models, poor timing, quality problems, and ultimately a loss of identity. Saturn started as a bold experiment, but GM's bureaucracy and financial struggles pulled it back into the same old problems it was meant to avoid. And yet Saturn left behind a legacy. For all its flaws, it proved that customers wanted a different experience. They wanted honesty. They wanted fair pricing. They wanted a brand that felt like it actually cared. In some ways, Saturn was ahead of its time. Today, brands like Tesla thrive on direct sales and strong fan communities, things Saturn was doing decades ago. Looking back, Saturn feels like a what-if story. What if GM had allowed it to stay independent? What if Saturn had gotten SUVs and mid-sized cars sooner? What if they had doubled down on quality instead of badge engineering? Could Saturn have survived? We'll never know. But one thing's for sure, Saturn was one of the most fascinating experiments in the modern auto industry. It shined bright for a moment, and then just as quickly, it was gone.